"Sir, I need you to come in. There's something on the recording from the rehearsal dinner that you have to hear. Come alone. Please don't mention this to your daughter." I stood in the kitchen holding my phone, staring at the frost on the back window. It was February, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache, the kind that settles into old houses and never quite leaves. I'd known Eleanor Marsh for 3 years. She'd coordinated my wife's memorial gathering, and when my daughter asked who I'd recommend for the rehearsal dinner, I gave her Eleanor's name without hesitation. She was thorough, quiet, professional, not the kind of woman who called people at 7 in the morning for nothing. I told her I'd be there by 10. I want to go back a little, because none of this makes sense without understanding what the year before had looked like. My wife passed in the spring of 2022. 41 years together. We'd built the house in Oakville ourselves. Well, we hired people, but Sylvia picked every tile, every light fixture, every piece of trim. She had opinions about doorknobs. I used to tease her about that. After she was gone, I walked through rooms and couldn't touch anything for months because everything was exactly where she'd put it. My daughter, Blythe, was 34. She lived in Toronto with her fiancé, a man named Garrett. He sold something in finance. I was never entirely sure what, exactly. He talked the way some people in that world do, in a language designed to sound impressive and mean as little as possible. But Blythe loved him. She was happy, or she seemed to be, and I had learned long ago that my job was not to choose for her, but to be there regardless of my own preferences. My son, Curtis, was 30. He'd moved back to Oakville 18 months after his mother died. Initially to help me with the house, he said. I was grateful at first. Genuinely. The yard needed work. There were things I couldn't reach anymore. And the silence in a big house after decades of noise is something people don't warn you about. Curtis came with his girlfriend, a woman named Petra. They took the 2 rooms at the end of the hall and settled in. I asked no one's permission for this arrangement because it never occurred to me to need to. It was my son. But the weeks turned to months. 18 months passed, and Curtis had not found work. Petra did some remote contract work, I never knew quite what, and they paid nothing toward groceries, utilities, or the mortgage. When I mentioned it once, gently, Curtis said he was figuring things out. When I said I was getting older and might need to think about the future of the house, Blythe, who had been visiting for the weekend, said I shouldn't stress myself about money. "We'll figure it out as a family, Dad." She said it the way you say something to end a conversation, not to start one. I am 67 years old. I retired at 63 from 32 years in municipal engineering. I have a pension, some investments, and the house. By most measures, I'm comfortable. I'm not wealthy in any dramatic sense, but I'd been careful, and Sylvia and I had planned well. Our estate was not complicated. The house, an RRSP, a TFSA, a small portfolio. We had a will drawn up years ago by our family lawyer, Alan Fitch, that split things evenly between Blythe and Curtis, with a few charitable bequests Sylvia had wanted included. The will had not been updated since Sylvia died. I mention this because it matters later. Blythe and Garrett's engagement had been announced the previous September. The wedding was set for June. I offered to help with costs. It was something I wanted to do, something I felt Sylvia would have wanted, and Blythe had accepted graciously. Somewhere around $22,000 eventually went from my account to various vendors, caterers, a florist in Burlington, and Eleanor Marsh's coordinating fee, which she charged only partially because she said she'd known Sylvia, and this one was personal. The rehearsal dinner was a Thursday in early February, held at a restaurant in the Distillery District that Garrett's family had a connection to. I wore the gray suit I'd bought for Sylvia's memorial and then hung back in the closet. It felt wrong to wear it for something joyful, but I didn't own another one that fit anymore. Blythe looked beautiful. Garrett was in good spirits. His parents were pleasant people. Not warm exactly, but not unkind. The evening went smoothly, or I thought it did. I'd left early. Around 9:30. I was tired, my knee had been bothering me all week, and the drive back to Oakville in February dark was not something I wanted to do past 10. I hugged Blythe, shook hands with Garrett, and said goodnight to Eleanor on the way out. She had been setting something up near the bar with a small audio system she used for background music playlists. She nodded at me. Nothing unusual. The next morning, she called. I drove into Toronto through gray slush on the 403. Eleanor's office was above a florist on Queen Street West, a small space that smelled like dried flowers and coffee. She answered the door herself. There was no receptionist, no assistant. She looked like she hadn't slept well. She poured me coffee without asking and sat across from me at her work table, which was covered in binders and color-coded folders. "I want to explain what happened before I play you anything," she said. "I don't want you to think I was listening in on purpose." The audio system she used for events had a wireless microphone component she sometimes clipped near the bar for ambient sound balance. She'd forgotten to switch it off when she left the setup to go manage something near the entrance. It had continued recording for approximately 90 minutes. She hadn't known until she went through the evening's files the following morning, as she always did, to note anything for future events at that venue. She had heard enough to know she needed to call me. She pressed play. The first voice I recognized immediately. It was Curtis. He was talking to someone, lower, harder to hear at first. Then the second voice clarified. It was Blythe. They were not talking about the wedding. They were talking about the house. What I heard, across maybe 14 minutes of recorded conversation with a gap in the middle where someone walked by and the voices dropped, was this: Curtis believed, and Blythe did not correct him, that when I died, the house would sell for somewhere around $900,000. That was probably accurate, given what had happened to property values in Oakville in the past 4 years. Curtis said he'd looked it up. He mentioned a street nearby where a similar house had sold for $940. He said he planned to stay until it happens. Those were the words. Until it happens. Those were the words. Until it happens. He wasn't talking about finding a job or getting his own place. He was talking about waiting. Then Blythe said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "The only thing I'm worried about is if he changes the will. He's been weird about money since Mom died." Curtis said he won't. He doesn't like conflict. There was a pause. Then Blythe said, "Garrett thinks we should get him to add us to the accounts now, like as a joint thing, for his care if anything happens." Curtis laughed. It was a short, flat sound. "That's not a bad idea, actually." Blythe said, "I'll bring it up after the wedding. He'll be in a good mood." Eleanor stopped the recording. I sat there. The coffee in front of me had gone cold without my noticing. Outside on Queen Street, a streetcar went by, and I heard its bell faintly through the window. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "I went back and forth about whether to call you, but I kept thinking about Sylvia. She used to talk about you. At the memorial, she said you were the kind of person who deserved to know things." I thanked her. I meant it. I didn't trust myself to say much more. I drove back to Oakville very carefully. The roads were wet, and I was not paying full attention, and I knew it, so I drove under the limit the whole way, gripping the wheel, watching the distance. I want to be honest about what the next few days were like, because I think people imagine that in moments like these, you become decisive and clear-eyed immediately. That's not true. What I felt first was not anger. It was something quieter and more disorienting. Something like vertigo, because the conversation I had overheard was not a moment of weakness. It was not a slip. It was a plan, spoken casually, between two people who had clearly thought about it more than once. Curtis, who I had let live in my house for 18 months, who I had fed, whose girlfriend's laundry went through my machines every week. Blythe, whose rehearsal dinner I had partly paid for, who had stood in my kitchen 2 months earlier saying we'll figure it out as a family. I did not confront either of them. This was deliberate. I called Alan Fitch the Monday after Eleanor's call. Alan had done our wills when Sylvia and I were in our 40s, and he'd handled the estate process when she died. He was in his late 60s himself now, semi-retired, working out of an office in Burlington that smelled like old wood and printer paper. I told him I needed to update the will and that I wanted to talk about some structural changes. I didn't tell him why, not at first. He listened the way good lawyers listen, without filling silences. When I finished, he said, "All right, let's look at what you have and what makes sense." What we did over 2 meetings in several weeks was not dramatic. I didn't disinherit anyone. I want to be clear about that. Because when people tell stories like this, the ending is often some grand gesture of cutting people off completely. That wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was to no longer be a passive participant in my own financial future. We updated the will to move the majority of the estate into a testamentary trust rather than a direct bequest. The house, when sold, would go into the trust. Distributions would be made by a trustee, Alan's firm, not my children, over a period of time and for specific purposes. The accounts I had could not simply be empty by anyone being added as a joint holder without careful, separate legal steps that would now require my demonstrated consent through a process, not a casual conversation over Sunday dinner. I also, quietly, found an apartment, not to move into immediately, to have. A bachelor unit in a small building in Burlington, close to the marina, month to month. I wanted a place that was mine alone, not the house that had been Sylvia's too, not the house where 2 people were waiting for me to die, a place where the furniture was chosen by no one, with any agenda other than my own comfort. I told no one. Curtis and Petra were still living in the back rooms. I cooked dinner most nights. I drove Petra to a medical appointment once when her car wouldn't start. Because that is the kind of person I am, or the kind I had always thought I was. I smiled at meals. I asked questions about their days. I was, to all appearances, the same man I had always been, someone who didn't like conflict, who could be counted on not to make waves, who would probably be in a good mood after the wedding. I was no longer that man. I was just someone who looked like him from the outside. The wedding was in June, at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was genuinely beautiful. I won't take that away from it. The weather was perfect, the kind of clear June day that feels like a reward after a long Ontario winter. Blythe was radiant in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl and thought the world was entirely good. I stood in the front row and I watched my daughter get married, and I felt both things at once, grief and love, the way you often do at important moments when the person you most want to share it with is gone. I gave a short toast at dinner. I talked about Sylvia. I kept it simple. Several people cried. Garrett hugged me afterward and said, "We're glad to have you in the family, Walter." His father's name was Walter. I told him at Christmas that my name was not Walter, that I'd always gone by my middle name. He'd nodded and kept doing it. I smiled and said, "Thank you." 3 weeks after the wedding, on a Tuesday evening when Curtis and Petra had gone out, I moved the last of what I needed from my bedroom into the trunk of my car. Not furniture, clothes, documents, a box of photographs I'd been slowly going through, the small things that are actually yours when you strip away everything that belongs to a place. I left a note on the kitchen table. It said that I was taking some time for myself, that I would be in touch, and that I'd arranged for the utilities to be settled through the end of July, after which the accounts would revert to my sole management. I left Alan Fitch's contact information at the bottom because I wanted them to understand when they called that there was a lawyer involved now. I drove to Burlington in the early evening with the windows down a little, even though it was still warm. The apartment was on the 4th floor, facing west. I could see the water from the window if I stood at the right angle. I put the box of photographs on the kitchen counter. I sat down in the one chair I'd bought. There is something people don't tell you about doing a hard thing calmly. It doesn't feel the way you expect. You expect relief. What you actually feel at first is a kind of hollow space where something used to be. It's not regret, exactly. It's the weight of having loved people who did not protect that love the way they should have, and knowing you are old enough now to stop pretending otherwise. Curtis called that Thursday, then again Friday. On Saturday he came to the house and found it locked. I had changed the code on the garage and had the front lock rekeyed 2 weeks prior, and called me from the driveway. I answered. I told him calmly that the living arrangement had worked well for a time, but that it needed to come to an end. I told him he had 30 days, which was more than legally required, and that I would cover 1 month of first and last at a modest rental nearby if he needed it, because I was his father, and that was a reasonable thing to do. He raised his voice. I stayed quiet. Eventually he ran out of things to say. Blythe called the same afternoon. She was upset in a different way than Curtis, not loud but careful and precise in her language, which told me she and Garrett had discussed what to say beforehand. She asked if I was having some sort of episode. She said she was worried about me. She mentioned, gently, that she and Garrett had been thinking about what would make sense for my future care, and that they'd love to discuss some arrangements with me. I told her I had recently updated my will and estate plan with my lawyer, and that I was feeling very clear-headed about the future. I told her I loved her, and that the wedding had been beautiful. The conversation ended shortly after. I stood at my window that evening, looking at the water in the distance. The sun was going down behind Burlington Bay, going pink and gold, the way it does on summer evenings here. The kind of light Sylvia used to call embarrassingly pretty, meaning it was almost too much. Alan had mentioned when we finished the estate work that I should review everything once a year going forward. Keep it current, don't let it drift. I told him I would. I meant it. I thought about my children that evening. Not with anger, which had never really arrived in any useful form. I thought about them the way you think about things that have changed shape. You can still recognize what they were. You can still remember holding them when they were small. You can still love them in the complicated way that doesn't require them to be good to you. But you can also, finally, stop organizing your life around the version of them you wished they were. That was the thing no one had told me was possible at 67. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, a 40 Creek, which is what I'd been drinking since a colleague gave me a bottle years ago, and I sat in my chair and I watched the last of the light go out over the bay. I hadn't felt this quiet in a long time. Not empty, not bitter, just quiet. The way a house feels when you finally put everything in its right place. I had time now. I wasn't sure for what yet, but it was mine.